Let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for having this hearing today and want to welcome all the witnesses here today for your valuable testimony. And obviously want to welcome President Giebert from the Illinois Farm Bureau. We're proud and honored to have you here as the Illinois Farm Bureau President. I like to remind people they're sometimes surprised that agriculture and agribusiness is the #1 industry in the state of Illinois. And 4 of the last 5 years, Illinois has led the nation in soybean production, and we're awful proud of that. My congressional district is the 8th largest in the country in terms of corn and soybean production, so agriculture is vitally important. And I think as I've heard the discussion here today on China, I think it's important to put things into perspective. If you go back a year ago, and we were in this trade war with China, what we heard when we talked to manufacturers and farmers and people that were concerned, international companies, people wanted predictability and certainty. That's what we heard constantly, predictability and certainty. And how do you get that? Well, you get that through trade agreements. And so fast forward a year, we now have trade agreements with our 4 largest trading partners in this country. USMCA with Mexico and Canada, Phase 1 with China, and a trade deal with Japan. And when you think about that certainty, somebody mentioned it earlier, when we think about the marketplace worldwide, 96% of the marketplace is outside of the United States. So we have to have customers and we have to have markets. And so when I think about the Phase 1 deal and how it affects agriculture, but also manufacturing, I go back and think about the tariff strategy. And listen, I'm not necessarily a fan of tariffs as a free market conservative, but I look at what tariffs have done in terms of leverage to get the deal we got in the end with Phase 1. And it may not be perfect, but it is progress from my point of view. And as I look at this, and we look at that predictability that we now have, and when you look at when China came into the WTO in 2001, the argument at the time was, bring them in and they're going to abide by all the same standards of every other industrialized country in the world. Well, clearly that hasn't happened. And I've paid acute attention to that when it comes to agriculture. And you look at the cases we've had in the World Trade Organization where we have won ultimately in the ag space, but it has taken 2 to 4 years. And so there's not a mechanism, a dispute resolution to go to get the resolution. And Mr. Giebert, maybe at this point I may ask you to talk a little bit about that frustration of having to go to the World Trade Organization, to wait an extended period of time, to finally get a result that we should have gotten quicker. And now, with this dispute resolution mechanism we have in place and the fact that we can put tariffs back in place and how that will affect agriculture and future negotiation with China.
Well, thank you very much for the question, Mr. LaHood. And you know, it has been frustrating for a number of years with the cases that have been filed with the WTO, the length of time that it takes to resolve whatever the issue may be. And as was mentioned here earlier by your colleagues, that it's long past the issue whenever that resolve comes to pass. I think with this Phase 1 agreement we see with the enforcement, the ability to put tariffs on almost immediately, or at least to bring folks to the table to try and resolve them diplomatically and get to a point where we can move on is monumental. And maybe as we look to other trade agreements around the world, maybe this is the new way of putting agreements together.
Thank you for that. And I may, Mr. Stratford, I found it interesting your analogy used in your opening statement about soccer versus football. But I think what was missing from that analogy is every other industrialized country in the world, and whether they're in Europe or Japan or Korea, is affected the same way. They're going up against a China that is very much protective and regressive and really an unreliable system with many inequities. So it's not just the U.S. that's going on that playing field. It is every other country in the world. And so what do we do to change that behavior? Again, I think this approach is a good one to start off with. And I give a lot of credit. I know many of my colleagues on the other side praise Bob Lighthizer, and they should. There is not a more capable trade negotiator than Bob Lighthizer and his knowledge of trade negotiations. And he's the one that got this agreement done with China. I would just ask your opinion in terms of other countries have watched closely our strategy here and how this has played out.
Well, I think obviously other countries have looked at this with great interest, and on the one hand, they've hoped that the U.S. could be successful and that we could get China to agree to disciplines that then could be multilateralized in the WTO. And I think right now it's just too early to say because we've just got this sort of interim truce. We're very much still in the middle of these negotiations, and so I think the jury is still out on how effective they are. The concern is that the disruption may overpower the good that's coming, and the jury's still out on that. So we have to see how we can carry it forward from here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania.